Welcome to the Writing Black Joy podcast, where we celebrate the joyful narratives of Black creatives, changing the world one story at a time. I am your host, Safiya Robinson. Here, you'll find conversations with some amazing Black writers and creatives, learn more about their projects and the joy they're bringing into the world, find inspiration for your own creative ventures, and dive deep into the topics that we think and write about. The guests on this podcast are writers of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, music, plays, and so much more, as well as creative guests whose work is all around writing joyful narratives on history's pages. So if you are a writer, a creative, or a lover of the arts, or you simply want to hear some good conversations, keep on listening and welcome to the show. Welcome to Writing Black Joy. A new season is here. I want to say season 4 or 5, or I don't know if you're counting the special mini season they did earlier this year, but honestly, it doesn't even matter. It has been 3 years of this project that I turned into a podcast, and I am celebrating. I've had amazing guests over the past 3 years, starting with people that I knew personally and branching out to meeting new guests, dream guests, and even meeting with folks in person. It has been and continues to be an incredible ride, and this upcoming season is no exception. So, welcome to my loyal listeners and welcome to newcomers and everyone in between. I love bringing these conversations to you, and I'm glad to have the opportunity for another season. Now, one of the guests you're going to hear in a few weeks' time is Dionne Draper. And we had so much fun recording that when she kindly offered to interview me for the podcast, I said yes. So first, a bit about Dionne. Dionne Draper is the executive producer and host of DAWTA The Podcast, founder of Sing with Soul, and a professional writer, actor, and singer who combines academia, racial justice, and music to empower diverse voices. You will hear an in-depth conversation with Dionne soon, and you'll learn a little bit more about her in the conversation today. But also, I feel like I'm the guest today, which is kind of weird. Do I read a bio for myself and pretend like I'm a proper guest? Maybe not. But I'm also aware that I do have some new listeners, and so I will share a little bit about me. So, it's me. I'm Safiya Robinson, and I am the creator, host, and producer behind this podcast. I'm also a writer and a creative, a sister, an aunt, and a niece, a friend, and maybe even a mortal enemy to someone. And I am a reader and a lover of the arts. When I'm not podcasting or writing or starting crochet projects that I struggle to finish or singing in a choir, I teach at university in Plymouth, and I still maintain a clinical practice. And I'm also a writing coach and editor. That is all I will say for the moment. You'll learn more about me as the season progresses, or if you listen to previous episodes. Speaking of listening to other episodes, please hit subscribe and share this podcast with a friend who you think would love to listen to good conversations about life, about creativity and writing, about good books and shows, and so much more. I am so happy to have you here. And now, as Super Grover would say, on with our show. In this episode, Dionne and I talked about my journey with the podcast and how it has evolved into a wider range of conversations, how the nature of humanity is seasonal and leads to our projects changing, the recurring themes from this season, including reinvention, everyday storytellers, and joy in the midst of life, as well as legacy, to name a few. Creating designs and merch for the podcast. And if you have a look in the show notes, you will find links to some of the podcast merch, including my new card deck, which Dionne and I talk a little bit about in this episode as well. How my own creative rhythm has changed over the past few years, especially during podcast mode when it struggles a bit. The dreams I have for my podcast, including dream guests. Mistakes I made when I started out, although I guess in hindsight, I don't really see them as mistakes. Plans for the future, including a Q&A, live events, and I'm open to suggestions from listeners, so please feel free to drop me an email. The address is in the show notes. The power of vision and visioning as a part of the creative process, and so much more. I really enjoy the conversation, and I hope you do too.
Tell me a bit more about how, obviously you've been doing this show, but it's evolved this season. What's the journey? What's the story?
Yeah, so 3-year anniversary, just celebrated that a few weeks ago. And, yeah, it's definitely evolved. When I started the podcast, I was telling someone the other day, it wasn't supposed to be a podcast. I had this idea, and then the small version of that idea, I wanted to create a writer's gallery. So I had this kind of like vision of something that would be like an art gallery, but for writers, but virtual. And I was like, okay, it's going to be great. I create this website. In hindsight, was really terrible because I'm not a web designer, but I did a website, and I wanted to have a way for people to get to know the writers of these pieces. So I came up with these questions. I decided to record them audio, and the podcast kind of grew from those audio recordings. The website no longer exists. If you go to Writing Black Joy, you'll just find links now to the podcast. Maybe I'll bring it back one day, but as I said, web design is not my forte, and I'm loving the podcast. So that's how it has evolved from the beginning. This season, I wanted to have some different conversations, mostly because there's just so many facets to how people write about joy or how people express joy in their creativity, but also because I just wanted to be having a different type of conversation. So for argument's sake, I've got, like I said, I've got Karen Warren, and she and I talked about her book. She's written about activism, and she's also written about, aging. So we talked about joy with activism and aging. I have another Karen, and she's a photographer, and we talked a lot about changing the narrative around Black women in photography, which was a really amazing conversation. Obviously you and I have had a conversation, and we talked a lot about joy through, everything, through a pandemic, through creating your own, one woman performance, etc. So we talked a bit about that. And then I have other people who we talked about their books, so Gregory and we talked about his book where he wrote about his kind of like career journey. There's just so many people, like Shakira Bourne, and she and I talked about her writing journey. She writes YA novels. And so we talked a lot about the writing process. So I just wanted to have different conversations. And I know sometimes that makes it hard to describe to people what the podcast is. But, my sister said to me once, it's your podcast. If you can't do what you want to do, what are we even doing here? So
Absolutely. And I do understand, having a podcast myself, I do understand that seasons change. We are seasons. We are seasonal people. We have different seasons, literally, where we want to explore and experience and broaden our minds. And that sounds like where you've been coming from with this season, how it's evolved.
Yeah. It is. And also because I think there's so many different ways that stories are told, and how we relate to one another. And so I was like, I don't want to just be talking about genres. I don't just want to be today we're writing a romance novel or whatever. I love those conversations. I write romance novels. I write all the things. So I love those conversations, but I also wanted to talk a bit more about everyday life and people's lives and how they're living, their own joy. So that's kind of how the show has evolved this season. We'll see. We'll see what happens next season. I can't promise from one season to the next what'll be present, but I know that I kind of just, as you said, I just lean into the conversations that I want to have. And I really loved the conversations I've had this season. Really, really loved them.
Brilliant. Oh, I can't wait to listen to some of the people that you've mentioned already. So what have you discovered that there's some recurring themes between them? Obviously it's a joy podcast, but are there recurring themes that you were unexpected maybe?
Oh my goodness, they have been. And I think that to me, like before we hit record, one of the things I was saying to you is that I feel like creativity has its own magic. If anybody wants me to explain that to them, come meet me. We'll sit, we'll have some tea, we'll talk about it. But it always feels magic to me in that way. So even though this season I was having lots of different conversations about lots of different topics, there are some themes that just kept returning. One of them is something I call everyday storytellers. I actually wrote a blog post about it. And it's just about this idea of the importance of all of our stories and not just celebrities or, you know, we're in the UK, so people talk about the royals, but I'm like, the person that you meet, you know, on the bus or whoever, like, are you yourself? Your stories are really important. They matter. And so I really believe that people should be telling their stories, even if they don't feel like, you know, people who think, oh, I'm not important. Who would want to listen to my story? I'm like, somebody else out there who's having a similar experience will love to hear your story. And you'll be so surprised at how many people there are out there like that. So I would say,
everyday
storytellers. That's one. Reinvention has come up so much. And I think as creatives, this is a way of life. Reinvention and evolution and growth. And one day you're creating this thing and next thing you're creating something else. So that's come up a lot in career, in life, in creativity, in creative practices. Joy in the midst of whatever happens in life. You and I talked about that, but that's come up in quite a few conversations. Obviously we talk about the writing process because, you know, I could talk about, I'm a writer. It's almost impossible for me not to meet with a writer and us not talk about writing. So that will always come up. But the other thing that has come up quite a lot is the idea around legacy. Quite a few conversations I've had have come up talking about legacy and how writing and telling our stories, you know, it carries a lot of legacy. It makes me think about oral traditions and how, you know, stories would have been passed down. And now we have YouTube and books, you know, TV shows and whatever. But like just the idea of legacy being more than a financial piece or whatever, but just like your story could be a legacy to the next generation. And so we talked a bit about that. And I know even in the previous season, my sister and I discussed that a bit as well. So yeah, those are probably some of the recurring themes that have come up in amongst all the other themes that I've already mentioned.
But it's really interesting. I think that that's almost another piece of work. It seems to me when you start to be able to summarize some of that, you know, get those extracts of what are common themes, it feels like there's some work there around that. And what connects things. I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know either.
Significant. It seems significant that there are themes that are common to all.
Yeah, I definitely think that. And there's another project that I'm working on where I'm pulling together some excerpts from different episodes. And I think that's a great way to do it in terms of some of the themes that have come up, because I think that those are powerful themes within itself. Like I've sometimes what happens when these things come up is I think to myself that, you know, I might have a whole episode on one of the themes.
It feels like it's speaking. It feels like it's making itself known, the fact that you have some themes.
Yeah.
And the question.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to be thinking on that for a while. Yeah.
So what is different? You've spoken a bit, I think, about what is different about this. It's something that stands out about this season. You spoke about how people are, you know, you're exploring their everyday stories, not simply about joy, but yeah.
So, obviously that's been different, having different types of conversations. That's been different. The Joy 5, but that's a new segment that I came up with every guest that I recorded with this summer. So it's not every episode of the season, but every guest that I recorded with this summer. And like at the end, we have a series of questions called a Joy 5, but that's been a change. And I've been doing designs. This has been mind blowing to me because I am not a visual person. Always a person who's like, I'm not an artist. I'm not a whatever. And I suddenly got this idea of maybe like a year ago or so, earlier this year, to do some designs. So I created some designs. Out of that came things like my card deck. If you go onto the website, you'll see a link to the card deck, but you've seen it already, haven't you, Dionne?
I love the card decks. Your blessing pack.
My blessing pack.
Your Pack of blessings.
I love it. I love it, love it, love it. So the card deck has come out of that. And then some of you listening, you might have gotten a card from me somewhere because I've been giving them away at different events. I've got a design that I've put on like a sweater. So when it gets a bit colder, I'll be wearing that around. And that in itself has kind of like sprung other things that go along with the podcast. So having those designs, having those items available, you can purchase a card deck if you want to. And more of that to come, right? Like I've been enjoying exploring that side of my creativity around the podcast. So that's been fun. So those are probably the main things about the podcast that has changed. I suspect that because I have a different working pattern now to when I started the podcast a few years ago, I imagine there'll be one main sort of season, which is in October, because then I can record over the summer, which makes sense for my current rhythm. And so that's what's different as well in terms of when it's releasing. I usually have a season that released in February. This February, I did a mini season, so it wasn't quite the same. So that sort of rhythm has changed, but the podcast isn't going anywhere. So, likely we'll have another season, like full proper season next October. So yeah, those are some of the things that have changed. And, yeah, I've been fortunate to have some really good guests.
Thank you. So how has the season impacted your creative practice? I would have thought that there may be many inspirations when you talk to other people.
Yeah.
But then I also, knowing how labor intensive podcasts are, can imagine that it wouldn't be as easy to implement your creative practice.
This is it. This is the push and pull. So you're right. I get so much inspiration, all the conversations. Every time I have a conversation with somebody, I write down ideas. I got blog posts I want to write. I got this, that. I don't always have the headspace to do it because when I'm in podcasting mode, like right now, I'm in the mode of editing and you have podcasting on, so you know all the steps, yeah. Right? I went to Bristol a few days ago. On the train, I went up doing all the show notes. Coming back down on the train, I was standing, so I couldn't do anything. But yeah, recording, editing, show notes, pre-recording, creating, interviewing, coming up with people's questions, reading people's books. Like, there's a whole lot that goes into it, and so I think it has made it hard. Like I've missed doing my own writing. I haven't done a bit of writing for a while. I've missed doing some of my own creativity as well. And so I think having the seasonal rhythm is good for me in that way, because I know that right now I'm like deep in podcast mode, but once that bit is done and the season is over, then I have some time to create in other ways. But also I think because, my sister has this theory that she's heard from someone. I wish I could remember where she heard it from, because then I would credit them, but I can't. But she said to me that if your brain is tired, create with your hands. If your hands are tired, create with your brain. Something like this. Mm-hmm. So what I've been able to do now, like I started some new cross stitch projects and things like that. So that's how I kind of come down after I've been doing a lot of editing and stuff like that. Just pick up a cross stitch, work on that. So that's been good for it in that sort of way, because that kind of helps me to unwind after I've done a lot of computer heavy stuff.
Thank you. That sounds really interesting and very real around the struggles and that push and pull that you talk about. So what are your favorite moments of the season?
Now, you see, I put this question for context. These are questions that I came up with, but this is a ridiculous question because I don't pick favorites ever.
Come on, who's your favorite?
But I'm not going to tell you who my favorite guest is, but I will tell you some of my favorite moments. So a couple of my favorite moments are that this season, as I've managed for the last couple of seasons, I've had some of my dream guests on. I have a list of dream guests that I keep, right? And, some of them are probably a little bit out of reach, but I don't care. I don't care how out of reach it feels. They're going on my list, right? So, if anybody wants to point my lovely writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie towards me, please, I would love that. I appreciate I can even put the list in the show notes if anybody knows anybody. But I tell you that what I have found talking about the podcast has always been the thing that has brought in the dream guests. All right. So I'm all about talking about your dreams. So this season, as I have done for the last couple of seasons, I've got a couple of dream guests on that we just had amazing conversations. I've really enjoyed. And that's been fantastic.
Let's call some more in. Come on, you said Chimamanda. Come on,
you know what? I'm gonna pull my list up.
Let's affirm
some more of my dream guests. And if you're listening, dream guests,
come on. You won't regret it.
Well, it's good. It's good fun. So here we go. Dream interview roster. David Harewood. I want Sonia Renee Taylor. She's written My Body Is Not an Apology. I love that. Adrienne Marie Brown. Dr. Sean Jenwright. I would love to have him on. If anybody knows him. Trevor Noah. He's probably a little bit more out of reach, but
Trevor, listen to his podcast. I'm loving his podcast.
I love his podcast. Yeah. Gina Sherry. She's an amazing
Gina.
comedian.
Well, she's UK.
I know she is. She absolutely is.
I know she's living in LA now, but
she's in LA now, but that's okay. That's brilliant. There's a young man called, I'm going to hopefully say his name correctly, Chidiebere Ibe, and he does some amazing. So of course I'm in a healthcare field, and he does these drawings of, like an anatomically correct drawings, but for people with different skin colors, which, like I'm in healthcare, I teach other healthcare professionals. And I think it's something that is not seen that often. So I would love to have him.
Well, we might have a way in because Bristol, the NHS in Bristol have been doing a lot of work over the past year around asking members of the Afro-Caribbean community to come in and have different parts of their bodies photographed for medical journals.
Wow. Oh. That sounds fantastic. I hope people are going in and doing that because that is really important. Earlier we talked about legacy, and I'm like, this is a part of legacy. So that would that will take me off on a
calling it in.
So I won't calling it in. But these are some of the people that I would love to have on. There's a UK based sketch show that I love called Famalam, and I actually want them all on, all the writers and even the performers. So yeah, I have a long list.
And you could even maybe get them as a group.
That would be awesome. Listen, the dreams I have for this podcast are, but like outrageous.
I love that. And I love that vision that you have.
Yeah. And that being said, every season I've had at least one or two of the guests on my dream list on this podcast. So I continue to curate the list, and I just continue to hold space for those folks to come out. And also another favorite moments of mine is just like asking people, do you know anybody who wants to come on the podcast? Meeting people like Dionne, meeting Hannah, who was your amazing director, having awesome, meeting you guys online, meeting people in real life. I've had some great in real life meetings that have been to do with the podcast.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I wanted to move on to another question about, particularly for people who you've got a 3-year legacy now of podcasts, but there are people just starting out, and this would be a good opportunity to speak about what you'd want to do differently. You've spoken about how you are making changes for this season, but are there any things maybe people could learn from about what you'd do differently? Maybe some of the mistakes that you've made.
Yeah. So I feel like saying I didn't make any mistakes, because even though there were some things that went horribly wrong, I think that is a part of the creative process. So I don't like to think of them as mistakes. And I have to continually remind myself that if I had waited for it to be perfect, I would not have 3 years of podcast episodes out there. Right. So that I will start by saying that. That being said, I think I struggled with the positioning and branding of it when it first came out. And as you and I discussed just now, the topics are wide and varied, and they've always kind of been wide and varied. Even though the questions were more writing focused in the beginning. But I never wanted the podcast to be about writing. And I don't think I made that clear enough. I wanted it to be about, like, I'm from Barbados and we have a national anthem that I almost cry every time I hear it. And one of the phrases within the national anthem is we write our names on history's page. And for me, writing Black Joy is about the stories that we write on the pages of history. It's not about the writing process, even though, because I'm a writer, we talked about that a lot. And I think that was something that I wish I had understood sooner. And, you know, I have to force myself to not get too deep and nerdy into the writing process sometimes because everybody doesn't consider themselves to be writers. Even some of the guests that I have on this podcast who've written amazing things don't consider themselves to be writers for some reason, because of the ideas that we have about who a writer is and all of that. So a part of the podcast for me was to kind of break that idea around writers being this exclusive club that nobody could join, but also to talk about the things, to have those conversations. But I don't think I framed it very well when it first came out. And I think I'm still working on that. I think, you know.
And I think that's beautiful in the way that you've answered it, because it reminds us that it's an evolution, that we are constantly evolving, and it's okay to acknowledge that, particularly as a creative. It's essential that we evolve. So I know that with DAWTA, my podcast, I set out with the idea that it was a space for transracial adoptees to feel validated, heard, and recognize their story, a little bit of community, really. But it's evolved. Now I'm in a different season where I still want to reach out to the community, but now it's about well-being. But that also shifted, Safiya, with my season. Coming back to what we said about seasons, that's where I was in season 1. And then in season 2, I was in a different space. I wanted to talk and have conversations about other things.
Yeah. And I think, why I think that's important is because I think sometimes people do need a permission slip to evolve and to not feel like I was, you know, yesterday when I was talking to Hannah, one of the things you were talking about is how and I feel this in myself, sometimes it feels like the world has a prized place for people who focus on one thing and go deep on one topic, and that's it. And so the idea of, you know, especially if you find what you feel like is the winning formula, the idea of drifting away from that can seem quite scary. But I don't think, you know, I think, as you said, I think we are seasonal beings. We will evolve. And I think it's okay for our work to evolve with us. And I'm just going to lean. I just lean into that with a podcast, and also lean in, like I said, to trying to find ways of talking about it that people are able to more tune in and find the episodes that will resonate with them.
Yeah, that's always beautiful. I love discovering new podcasts and then thinking, oh my gosh, there's a whole back catalogue, and going and finding, really cherry picking the ones that absolutely suit me on that day, in that moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely.
Safiya, what's your proudest moment? 3 years. 3 years.
3 years. What is my proudest moment? You know, I think my proudest moment is probably the very first moment that I hit publish. actually, because I love that moment when an idea becomes manifest out into the world. Like that is something any creative understands. Like first you have this thing in your head and then you're working on it behind the scenes. And then all of a sudden it's a thing that's out there in the world that people can participate in. And so for me, I think my proudest moment was probably that ugly website that that no longer exists for anybody to look at, even putting that out there, even thinking to myself, like I had this idea and now somebody's put their headphones on and they're listening to it. So I think that was probably my proudest moment.
And counting their steps.
Yes.
Whilst listening to a podcast.
Yeah, they're out going for a walk and they're, let me hear what Safiya's guests have to say.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. The first moment you hit publish in your first episode. Yeah. Amazing. You'll never forget that.
No, I haven't forgotten it. And it was a good day. It was still a pandemic. I started this within the pandemic. So that's exactly what we're talking about. Those little moments of joy that, you have in the midst of all the crazy stuff that was going on back then. But yeah, no, I still remember that.
And did you know that there was going to be a 3 years later?
No, I didn't. To be honest, when I started the podcast, I didn't have that dream guest list. Like I said, I had a different idea in my mind. But one thing I realized was that it's one thing to talk about an idea and it's another thing to talk about something that's out there in the world. And this is one of the reasons why I'm a real fan. I talked about creating the tiny thing. And one of the reasons I'm such a proponent of creating this, starting off by creating a small version of a thing that you want to create is because when I started reaching out, because from season 2, I started reaching out to some of those dream guests, and some other guests are people that I kind of admired because they were publishing and putting things out into the world. I would reach out to them and I could say to them, if you want to hear some episodes, go over to, that very first season, I made the decision that I was going to find 10 people that I already knew and I was going to ask them to come on the show. And I think, I can't even remember what the question was that you asked me, but,
we were just talking about, did you know that there's going to be 3 years later?
Oh, yes. And I think that, when I was interviewing those 10 people, I had no idea what it was going to become. I didn't even know, like I said, that it was going to be a podcast, let alone that 3 years later I would have podcasts and I would be meeting these amazing people all over the world and having these conversations. Like I had no idea. And a couple of seasons ago, I almost stopped, actually. I almost stopped the podcast. Partially, I had moved to the UK. I'd changed roles. My brain was hurting from the change of job and role and type of work that I was doing. But also, I'd gotten a bit discouraged because I didn't feel like I had as many listeners as I wanted. And I also realized that I wasn't getting across to people what the show was about. And so I had this kind of like, do I change the name? Do I do this? Do I do that? And I was almost ready to give up the podcast. And I was talking to a friend about it. And I said to her, the truth is I'm just not ready for it to be over. It's as simple as that. So I decided until I'm ready for it to be over, it's not over.
Sounds good enough to me. Sounds a good enough reason to me. So my last question to you is, what are your future plans for the podcast?
Well, I definitely want to have some more of my dream guests on here. I would love that.
We called it out. We called
some names. Oh, there's another one, Bolu Babalulo. She's a lovely author who wrote one of my book that I really enjoyed last year. So yeah, I'm calling out my dream guests. Come join me. So that's one thing I would love to do in the future. I have some ideas around expanding the platform.
Have you ever thought about doing a Q&A? You know, some podcasts do like Q&As. I've thought about that before, like just a dedicated one each week. Also, I've thought about that because that is something where it's great for people to participate in. They can, you know, do a little audio of their question and you can just answer it, you know, and particularly as you had this idea, you have writing as a kernel, it just occurred to me, sweetie.
I love that. I love that idea. Oh, by the way, I love the book. I love ideas. So anybody has any ideas, please email me, writingblackjoy@gmail.com. Drop me a line. I'm happy to hear any ideas. But yeah, I'd love that. So yeah, that's a great idea. Q&A. That sounds fantastic.
I listen to them. I really do. A lot of my favorite shows do Q&As as well. They have their dedicated podcast theme, but then once a week, they usually do a Q&A as well.
I love that. Okay, Q&A. So anyone listening to this, email me. I'll put some links in the show notes. Ask me some questions. I'd love to do a Q&A. And I have some other ideas. So watch this space is what I would say. And again, this is another one of these dreams I have that I'm throwing out there. I want to do some in-person events. I would love to do a writing retreat. I would love to do, and I'm actually going to be doing this at the university for students, Black students during Black History Month. I'm going to be doing a dreaming and visioning circle. I really believe in the power of vision. So what I have found is that it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, like outing fires, solving problems. You know, even if you're somebody who's very invested in dismantling racism and dismantling white supremacy, etc., it's very easy to get bogged down into that and not to dream and vision the world that you want to create. And I don't think it's frivolous. I think it's actually a really key part of the process because I'm like, you know, we can tear this thing down and some other thing can spring up in its place because we have not taken the time to vision what we want to create. And I think vision is a big part of the creative process.
Absolutely.
And so I'm doing it at I'll be doing it within the university for the students, but that's another workshop I would love to bring either in person or
do a live event. I
want to do a live event.
And that'd be a podcast. So that could be a live podcast of the circle. And
I love that.
We did one last year. We did a live event, a podcast live. And it was really successful, actually. It was really, really had a DJ as well there and had guests.
All right. So we're throwing it out there into the world, Dionne.
Absolutely.
Live event, podcast recording. So I would love to meet some of my listeners, the ones that are my friends that I know. I would still love to meet you guys any day of the week, but even those who I don't know in person, I'd love to meet some of my listeners. I'd love to meet some of the guests in person that I've only ever met virtually. I would love a live event. I feel like I can picture this writing Black Joy or this dream Black Joy. I can picture this being such a fun and vibrant event. And I want to bring that to life. That's one of my dreams. So,
well, I think that sounds like very much within your grasp. I think that this episode has been full of your affirmations, your wishes. You've been showing us how vision is central to your work. You've used vision from the very beginning when you press publish all the way through to what your future vision is. So I think you're wonderful. And I think what you're doing is wonderful, and continue.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy that we got to meet and to connect, and we got to do both of our recordings.
Yeah.
And like this has been one of those moments that I've loved, just, you know, asking someone, the mutual contact that we have, do you know anybody who would be a great guest? And, you know, her being like, yeah, Dionne and Hannah, great guests, and just having such wonderful conversations with you guys.
And Saskia would be really good, who was the person who introduced us. She's phenomenal.
She did not put herself forward, but I will be reaching back out to her.
Yeah, I mean, just check her out. Yeah. She is phenomenal. What she's done with her business is like, wow, unbelievable. Academia,
Yes.
That's her space.
And that's the other thing. That's something that I've been thinking about as well, because I'm in the academic space now, and I have a lot of feelings about academia. I'm not going to go into them right now.
We will have another one.
I'll have a lot of feelings about academia, but also I've seen since I've been in academia, I've just seen I've met some incredible people. I've seen some incredible research and work coming out. And I would love to have a space to highlight that as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that would definitely be a wonderful episode. And, like I said, Saskia is really phenomenal. So she would be a really good person to have on. Lots of love.
Meet you. Lots of love. Bye, Dionne.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us today. You can find out more about our guests in the show notes below. And don't forget to hit subscribe and share this episode with a friend. Until next time, I send you big love.